Sergeant Douglas Parkinson crouched motionless in the elephant grass, his car 15 ready, watching 40 North Vietnamese soldiers pass within 10 meters of his position. For 6 hours, his 4-man long-range reconnaissance patrol had remained completely invisible while an entire enemy company moved around them. When they finally called in artillery on the position, 73 rounds later, not a single enemy soldier escaped. The North Vietnamese had no idea death had been watching them all day. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across South Vietnam, small teams of American soldiers were earning a reputation that would make the enemy fear darkness itself. The Vietnamese called them many names, but the one that stuck was simple and terrifying: ghosts. These were long-range reconnaissance patrols, LRRPs, and they were becoming the stuff of enemy nightmares. Why would hardened North Vietnamese regulars, men who had faced B-52 strikes and massive artillery barrages, speak of these small American teams in whispered, fearful tones? The answer lies in something more terrifying than any bomb: the knowledge that you're being hunted by something you can't see, can't hear, and can't escape. The Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol program emerged from a fundamental problem plaguing American forces. Conventional units were fighting blind. Massive search and destroy operations consumed enormous resources while producing minimal results. The enemy seemed to vanish before American forces could make contact, only to reappear when and where they chose. Intelligence was the missing piece. Without accurate, real-time information about enemy movements, American commanders were reduced to guessing where to deploy their forces. What was needed was something entirely different: small teams that could penetrate deep into enemy territory and remain undetected for days while gathering critical intelligence. The first LRRP units were formed in 1965 as division-level assets. Each major infantry division in Vietnam received authorization to establish a long-range reconnaissance patrol company consisting of approximately 118 men organized into small teams. These weren't elite soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were volunteers from conventional infantry units who had demonstrated exceptional fieldcraft and mental toughness. What made LRRP teams different wasn't just their mission, it was their entire approach to warfare. While regular infantry units moved through the jungle trying to find and engage the enemy, LRRP teams moved to avoid engagement altogether. Their job was to see without being seen, to gather intelligence without revealing their presence, and to call down devastation on unsuspecting enemy forces. Robert Ankeny, who served with the 1st Air Cavalry Division's LRRP unit, described the mental transformation. You learned to think like a ghost. You weren't there to fight a war, you were there to watch a war, and sometimes to direct death from a distance. Most teams consisted of 4 to 6 Americans, often supplemented by indigenous personnel who provided local knowledge and language skills. The radio operator was arguably the most critical team member. Everything depended on his ability to maintain communication with base, call for extraction, and direct artillery or air support when needed. The radio was literally the team's lifeline. Equipment selection reflected the unique requirements of LRRP missions. Teams traveled light, carrying only essential gear for multi-day operations in hostile territory. The standard weapon was the CAR-15, a shortened version of the M16 rifle. Many teams also carried sawed-off M79 grenade launchers for additional firepower and emergency signaling. But it was what they didn't carry that often proved most important. LRRP teams avoided anything that could create noise or reflection. Metal equipment was taped or replaced with silent alternatives. Canteens were filled completely to prevent sloshing. Even personal items were scrutinized for anything that might betray their presence. Camouflage went far beyond wearing the right uniform. LRRP teams developed face painting techniques that broke up human features and helped them blend with jungle shadows. This green and black camouflage became so distinctive that both allies and enemies began referring to LRRP personnel as men with green faces, a nickname adopted by other special operations units throughout the war. The insertion process required careful planning and precise execution. Helicopter insertion was the most vulnerable phase of any LRRP mission. The sound of rotor blades could alert enemy forces from kilometers away, and landing zones in enemy territory were always potential kill zones. To minimize detection, LRRP insertions often employed deception techniques. Multiple helicopters would perform false insertions at different locations before the actual team was inserted. This created uncertainty about where American forces had actually been deployed and made it difficult for enemy forces to pinpoint the team's location. Once on the ground, LRRP teams employed movement techniques that seemed to defy normal human limitations. They learned to move through vegetation without disturbing it, to cross streams without leaving footprints, and to navigate dense jungle without creating noise. The pace was deliberately slow and methodical. While conventional infantry might cover 8 to 10 kilometers per day, a LRRP team might travel only 2 kilometers, taking hours to move distances that could be walked in minutes. Every step was planned, every movement calculated to minimize detection risk. Gary Linderer, who served with Company F, 51st Infantry, described the movement philosophy. "We weren't trying to get somewhere fast. We were trying to get somewhere without anyone knowing we'd been there. Speed was the enemy of stealth, and stealth was everything." Observation posts were selected with extreme care. Teams looked for positions that provided good visibility while offering multiple escape routes. Teams often spent days in these positions, taking turns on watch while maintaining complete silence. The psychological demands were enormous. Teams spent 5 to 7 days in enemy territory, never certain whether they had been detected. The stress of maintaining absolute quiet while surrounded by enemy forces affected team members in ways that conventional combat training hadn't prepared them for. Sleep was taken in shifts, with team members remaining in full gear and ready for immediate movement. Meals consisted of cold rations consumed slowly and silently. Bodily functions had to be managed in ways that left no trace of human presence. Even minor injuries had to be treated without making noise or leaving medical waste. Communication protocols were designed to minimize radio detection risk. Teams maintained scheduled contact with base using brief coded transmissions. Radio operators learned to transmit vital information in seconds, knowing that longer communications increased the risk of enemy direction finding. The intelligence gathered by LRRP teams proved invaluable to division commanders. Teams could provide real-time information about enemy troop movements, supply operations, and base camp locations. This intelligence allowed American forces to position assets more effectively and launch targeted operations against verified enemy positions. But perhaps more importantly, LRRP teams could call for immediate strikes on enemy forces they observed. Artillery and air support could be directed onto targets within minutes of detection. Enemy forces that had grown accustomed to moving freely through areas they considered secure suddenly found themselves under devastating fire that seemed to come from nowhere. The psychological impact on enemy forces was profound and measurable. Captured documents revealed that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong commanders had developed specific protocols for dealing with suspected LRRP presence. Areas where teams had been active were treated with extreme caution, with enemy forces altering movement patterns and avoiding previously secure routes. One captured North Vietnamese report described the impact. "American ghost teams have made movement during daylight hours too dangerous in sectors 7 and 9. Supply columns must now move only at night and use alternate routes that require twice the travel time." The enemy began developing counter-reconnaissance techniques specifically designed to detect and eliminate LRRP teams. These included systematic sweeps of areas where teams might be operating, the use of tracker dogs, and establishment of observation posts to watch for signs of American reconnaissance activity. Despite these countermeasures, LRRP teams continued to operate successfully throughout the war. Their effectiveness was measured not just in intelligence gathered, but in enemy forces eliminated through the strikes they directed. A single LRRP team could call down artillery barrages or airstrikes that eliminated entire enemy units, while never firing a shot themselves. Training began at specialized schools, designed specifically for reconnaissance personnel. The MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang became the primary training facility for LRRP personnel, teaching advanced patrolling techniques, survival skills, and specialized knowledge required for extended operations behind enemy lines. Training emphasized mental conditioning as much as physical skills. Students learned to operate effectively under extreme stress, to make critical decisions while exhausted and isolated, and to maintain team cohesion during extended periods of silence and inactivity. One of the most challenging aspects involved learning to suppress normal human instincts. Students had to overcome the natural tendency to seek shelter when under observation, to move quickly when frightened, and to communicate verbally when stressed. These deeply ingrained responses had to be replaced with behaviors that prioritized concealment over comfort. Advanced students learned tracking and counter-tracking techniques that allowed them to follow enemy forces while avoiding detection themselves. They studied enemy equipment and tactics, learned to recognize different types of enemy units by their movement patterns, and developed the ability to estimate enemy strength based on subtle environmental cues. The teams that emerged from this training operated with efficiency that often amazed conventional infantry units. LRRP teams could insert into an area, gather critical intelligence, and extract without leaving any trace of their presence. They became masters of what military theorists call invisible warfare, conflict conducted by forces that cannot be detected or engaged by conventional means. Robert Anconi recalled his transformation from conventional infantryman to LRRP operator. You stopped being a soldier and became something else. You were a set of eyes and ears that could appear anywhere without warning and disappear just as quickly. That's what made us ghosts. The teams earned their fearsome reputation through technical proficiency and psychological warfare that was often unintentional. Enemy forces never knew when they were being observed or where the next devastating strike might come from. This uncertainty created a climate of fear that affected enemy operations far beyond the immediate area of LRRP activities. The title Ghost wasn't just about stealth, it was about the ability to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. LRRP teams could observe enemy forces without being detected, strike without warning, and vanish before enemy forces could respond. From the enemy perspective, it was as if the dead were rising up to hunt them. Unit cohesion within LRRP teams reached levels that were remarkable even by military standards. Teams that operated successfully developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's movements and intentions. Team members could communicate complex tactical concepts through hand signals or even simple eye contact. This level of coordination was born of necessity. In situations where a single sound could mean death for the entire team, normal military communication protocols had to be abandoned in favor of more subtle methods. Teams developed their own systems of nonverbal communication that allowed them to coordinate complex operations in complete silence. The psychological warfare aspects of LRRP operations extended beyond their direct military impact. The knowledge that American reconnaissance teams could appear anywhere at any time forced enemy forces to alter their behavior patterns and adopt more cautious approaches to movement and operations. Enemy commanders had to allocate significant resources to counter reconnaissance activities that might otherwise have been used for offensive operations. Supply movements had to be conducted more carefully and often took longer routes to avoid areas where LRRP teams might be operating. The fear factor was real and measurable. Captured enemy personnel frequently mentioned concerns about American ghost teams during interrogations. Some enemy units began refusing assignments in areas where LRRP activity had been reported. The psychological impact of knowing that invisible observers might be watching created stress that affected enemy morale and operational effectiveness. By 1969, every major combat division had its own LRRP company, and specialized ranger companies had been formed to conduct similar operations at corps level. The success of these units proved that small, highly trained teams could achieve results that were impossible for larger conventional forces. The legacy of the LRRP units extends beyond their direct military contributions. They demonstrated that psychological warfare could be as effective as physical destruction, that fear could be a more powerful weapon than explosives, and that the ability to remain invisible could be more valuable than the ability to destroy targets. The enemy called them ghosts because that's what they had become. Invisible presences that could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish before anyone knew they had been there. They turned the jungle, which had been the enemy's greatest ally, into a place where death could be watching from any shadow. In the end, the LRRP teams achieved something that massive bombing campaigns and large-scale ground operations could not. They made the enemy afraid of the dark. They turned the very environment that had given North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces their greatest advantages into a source of constant anxiety. They were more feared than B-52s because bombers announced themselves with the roar of engines and the whistle of falling ordnance. You could hear them coming and prepare for their arrival, but the ghosts gave no warning. They simply watched, waited, and when the time was right, brought death from the sky to enemies who never knew they were being hunted. The enemy called them ghosts because in the green hell of Vietnam, that's exactly what they had become.